Donald Trump's crusade to stamp out all dissent within his administration is reaching dizzying new heights, but so is the resistance to his moves. Just this week alone, we saw the Trump administration attempt to fire CDC Director Susan Menarez, Federal Reserve Governor Lisa Cook, and railroad regulator Robert Primus. On top of that, a judge ruled against the firing of Voice of America Director Michael Abramowitz. All this week. Most of these are Senate-confirmed individuals, experts in their fields, who have all vowed to fight back against President Trump's abrupt and seemingly baseless oustings. Joining us are James Sample, professor of law at Hofstra University, and Susan Del Percio, Republican strategist and MSNBC political analyst. So, James, what's your level of concern with the firings and the moves that Donald Trump made just this week?
Well, it's clear that what we're dealing with here is a war on expertise, right? It is the one common thread that defines all of those individuals and all of the moves. It is a war on facts, especially when facts are bad for the administration. And not listed on that screen, but going back just to a couple of weeks, is the Bureau of Labor Statistics, right? When the numbers aren't and the facts and the analysis aren't what he wants them to be, the messenger, including scientific messengers, which is perhaps the scariest of all, and monetary policy, which is also quite scary.
Well, Defense Intelligence Agency had also, so there's that.
The messengers get fired, and we get, and loyalty is valued far, far more than accuracy.
Yeah, and I'm curious, sort of from the legal perspective, and then also from the political perspective. So, James, we'll go first. But this idea, isn't the goal here to sort of decimate the federal government so it's not effective, so Republicans can say, like, see, it doesn't work anyway? I mean, so many of these, they're sort of trying to make government less effective, and that's the stuff we saw in Project 2025, the unitary executive theory. I'm just wondering what the sort of legal, like a lot of this stuff the Supreme Court has said he can fire people, but there's definitely a lot of legal pushback there.
Yeah, without a doubt. I mean, I don't know that the administration is trying to decimate government so much as the administration is trying to decimate checks and balances. I mean, Eamon, you talked about that in the last segment. Checks and balances are the adversary for Donald Trump, and they are the adversary for the unitary executive. And so what you see, one of the common threads here, is just the idea that because Article 2, which it does, establishes one president as the executive branch, it's the only branch that does have one solitary individual as the head of the branch and as really the totality of that branch. That is true, but taking that and not having a limiting principle is really where Project 2025 wants to go. And to a certain extent, they're succeeding in getting there. They're getting stopped in the lower courts, but then it's going up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court, and sort of on a shadow docket basis, is sort of saying, well, we'll revisit this, but for now, you can do it. And so one of the things that I think is really playing itself out again and again and again is that even where there are limits, when the judiciary is the one imposing those limits, as opposed to Congress, which is basically asleep and seems to be perfectly happy being asleep, when the judiciary is the one imposing those limits, the courts can't move fast enough to keep up with an executive that is determined to do away with checks and balances.
I've worked in government before, and you see how good a workforce can be. Yes, there's like any place you go, there's some folks who aren't so great. But again, going to that civil servant, and that Donald Trump, before he came into office and in 2025, and since he said he wanted to eliminate civil service, and that battle is going on, is it not, James?
Yeah, absolutely.
And I mean, like that is when you take away that
civil service protections,
and then you're going right to labor. You're talking about fundamentally changing the whole operation of immediate necessary services.
Right.
Yeah.
And taking away their protections to do their jobs.
Well, they have made it so much easier to fire civil servants. Political appointees, it was always relatively easy to fire, but especially civil service protections. But take the case of federal governor Lisa Cook. This one I do find fascinating, because does he have any case? He's pursuing, and mortgage fraud has become, the new buzzword of looking at these different attacks on various political enemies. But with Fed Governor Lisa Cook, does Trump potentially not have a case? And is she going to end up, is she going to be reinstated, or does he potentially have a case here?
14 months ago, I would have told you he had no case in the immunity context, right? There was no constitutional basis for it in text or in history. Now, there is no constitutional basis in text or history for the president having a unilateral, unchecked power to fire a Federal Reserve governor. There is a for-cause provision, but even this Supreme Court, and I can't emphasize that enough because, well, Donald Trump's on a losing streak in the lower courts.
Yeah.
He's on an extraordinary winning streak in the Supreme Court. But even this Supreme Court, 3 months ago, in a procedural matter, in a case called Wilcox involving the National Labor Relations Board, said, and I'm quoting here, that the Federal Reserve is a uniquely structured quasi-private entity that follows in the distinct historical traditions of the first and second banks of the United States. That is the Supreme Court. And that was basically an aside. It was a tangent. It was not presented in that particular case. But that was the court at least sending a smoke signal that the Federal Reserve really is different. Now, is it so different that the court will be willing, if we get to that point, to step in and say, no, you can't just fire somebody on an unproven private conduct allegation that has not been adjudicated in any way, shape, or form on a for-cause basis? The Federal Reserve was structured with staggered 14-year terms for a reason. We don't want short-term presidential political interests to trump the long-term economic interests of the country.
So I have to ask you one quick question about the legality of this, the point that you brought up about the courts, basically, or the developments on the ground outpacing the movement of the courts. The growing concern is that as he accumulates some of these losses and they work their way up to the Supreme Court, that he may be at some point emboldened enough to either disregard or completely ignore a court order. Now, the administration said they're going to follow court orders, but the growing concern is that if they keep getting these low-level losses that ultimately translate at a Supreme Court, he may just get out of frustration to a point where he says, forget the courts, and at which point the courts are going to be unable to enforce these decisions. Have you seen anything on any of these low-level courts where the administration is trying to either fudge or try to sidestep a decision that is clearly telling them not to do something?
I mean, what you're describing, Eamon, is the constitutional crisis, right? That is the moment that so far both sides have avoided, right? The Supreme Court has avoided it in part by being relatively friendly to the president's, the administration's goals. The president has avoided it by not actually getting to that point where, you know, if you think of it as a game of chicken, somebody has to blink. In the lower courts, particularly in the deportation context, we've seen a number of Justice Department lawyers quasi-comply, quasi-sort of fake it and fudge things a little bit. And you've seen some district court judges get really frustrated with non-compliance with discovery processes and with basic court orders. If that translates all the way up, if that matriculates up, and if you see the administration do that vis-a-vis the Supreme Court, I don't have an answer for what then.
Yeah.
The what then is, that's exactly what the framers thought we would never amount to. That's less than we should be as a country.
Constitutional crisis.
Absolutely.
Yikes. James and Susan, thank you so much. When we come back, another GOP senator headed for the exits. What that could say about the party's image nationally, this is the Weekend Primetime.